Good. You okay? Yeah. I'm just getting my bearings. Yeah. Yeah. I'm incorporating. Yeah. First dinner.
That's right. There's a microphone here.
Okay.
Is it okay?
Oh, I mean, that's fine.
What's up?
We needed to see if we could connect my laptop because there's an app that I wanted them to do as part of the interactive.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, Brad's looking into that? Probably. Did you tell him that you wanted to do that? He's doing that.
He wanted to get me a water, so.
Oh, water too. Yeah.
Yeah. As
okay.
if I don't have enough, but yeah.
No, of course you need water.
So it gives me time to dry out.
Okay, yes, you want me?
Oh, I'm good. Okay. We're just going to
do that.
Don't mind me.
So, did you want the app at the beginning of the presentation or towards the end of it?
So it's the interactive. It's the poll questions.
Oh, okay.
But we don't have to do it.
Okay, it's up to you.
Okay. Like if we can just try one time, and if not.
Okay, great. Well then let's let you take a minute.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll give you one. Yeah. And I'll introduce you in a second.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
Computer set up myself. there's an HDMI here. If it means anything to you, Dr. Parker, some people may have to be back in the clinic at 1.
And my feelings won't be hurt. How many of you need to leave by 1? Okay.
Is this HDMI?
No, so. Nope. I can move.
I went to see about Veronica, who does all the IT stuff here.
Hey, you know what?
Okay. Alright, well, let me get you. So, Brad is going to get you water.
Okay.
And he'll be back soon.
And, go to the side. I took some things off the email.
I'm not sure how long it'll take to get it off of the thing. Is it okay with you using what you got?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. Can we move it up so that people on the West Valley campuses too?
Oh, okay.
Well, first I'll mention it. So I want to welcome you all to the January edition of the AIDS Education Training Center Lunch and Learn series. We have the distinguished honor of presenting to you Dr. Parker today. She conducts mixed methods research on women and minority health issues, doing a lot with prep work, reasons to uptake prep, interface between cultural issues and clinical access. And she has a lot of richness of knowledge and information to share with us today. So, Dr. Parker, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, whenever I talk about HIV or y'all see my necklace because I'm about to take it off. It coordinates. It'll be clicking all day. And for the people who are listening through the mic, I apologize. I'm a hand talker. I'll make it work. Okay, so what I do is I tell people that when I do, I hope so. What I do is I tell people when I do HIV research, it's easy for me to identify you can go ahead, I'm just multitasking. It's easy for me to identify a disease because, that's what people know. But technically, the work and the research that I do looks at the value that people place on when, why, and with who they have sex with. So I want you to think about that as I go through my presentation. And it is going to be informed by, I serve as the principal investigator of a project called Be Prepared, which looks at increasing knowledge about PrEP and addressing attitudes about biomedical prevention strategies amongst cis and trans women of color. And I'll talk about the difference shortly. My work as principal investigator for Lend Us Your Voice, in which I interviewed about 30 HIV-positive African-American women across the state of Texas and basically asked them 2 questions. How did you find out you were HIV positive? And what has your life been like since? And then another study I am currently doing, which is a risk assessment study. So collecting multiple variables on, again, why, with who, and when people have sex and the value they place on it across the 17 states that comprise the South. Now, if you were to look at the survey, you'd say, oh, okay, well, she's looking at sexual behaviors, attitudes towards condoms, things of that nature. but it's never that simple. And also to give you a little bit of background, I gotta say it. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. Go Falcons. Okay. So, for this presentation, I need to stress that although I'm going to use the term blacks and African Americans synonymously, they are not the same. In that, usually when we say or define African Americans, we are looking at people who are descendants from those that migrated, however one migrated, through the African diaspora during slavery. When we look at blacks and when we encompass or talk about blacks, it's usually viewed upon as a culture or an ethnicity. But to reduce confusion, since the title of the presentation was Blacks, HIV among blacks, I didn't want to make any changes. So for the objectives today, we'll talk about primary methods of transmission among blacks and African Americans as it relates to HIV, determine levels of influence and health and other health determinants that influence HIV infection among blacks and African Americans. And then we will appraise HIV prevention strategies to reduce infection rates amongst the target population that we are talking about. And additionally, a few things that I also want to focus on is the goal is to get us to think beyond individual behaviors. And then to look at how those strategies should encompass the approach for reducing HIV infections amongst African Americans. When I had to submit the paperwork for this presentation, I stated that I was going to share statistics, and this is where those cute little interactive slides would have came in. So I'm going to just read them to you because I had it all set up. It was poll questions. And has anybody ever used poll everywhere? Wonderful tool. So you present questions and people answer them through text, and the answers and the responses show up. So I'm going to tell you what I would have asked y'all. The first question would have been, true or false, in 2014, blacks or African Americans accounted for 30% of new HIV infections. Anybody want to? It's two questions. I'm very supportive. No matter what, you got a 50-50 chance of getting it right.
I think it's higher.
And it actually is higher. So, people would have texted true, false, and I'd have said, yes, it is correct. It is false. 44% for 19,540 cases of HIV infections diagnosed in 2014 were amongst African Americans. 44%. Yet African Americans make up 12% of the population. So when you hear that African Americans are disproportionately impacted, it's based on the percentage of cases or representation within the disease and the percentage of the population that they represent. Also, it's interesting because I'm used to doing presentations to people in the field of HIV, and I tell them I don't do statistics because y'all know it's a problem. So this was my way of fulfilling that goal. And then my next question would have been from 2005 to 2014. Thank you. New cases of HIV infections amongst African American women fell by approximately 49%. And the answer for that would have been true. Unfortunately, the number is still high compared to other races and ethnicities. In that same year, the estimated number of new HIV diagnoses amongst African American women is 5,128. Hispanic or Latino women, 1,350. White women, 1,483. Among all African Americans diagnosed with HIV, 67% were men. And the answer to that would have been false because it's higher. 73% of African Americans that were diagnosed in 2014 were men, or 14,305 African American men were diagnosed with HIV in 2014. And then the final question would have been percentage of men diagnosed what is the percentage of men diagnosed what is the percentage of African American men diagnosed with HIV that identified as gay or bisexual. Net response, you had like between 47, 57, and 67%. And that's one of those, like SAT always go with the one in the middle. And it would have been 57% or 11,201. The fastest growing age range for HIV diagnosis amongst African Americans across the board is 13 to 24. So, of the African American men that identified as gay or bisexual, 39% were between the ages of 13 and 24. All right, I'm not doubting anyone's intelligence, just to make sure we're on the same page. As I make reference to HIV, or the human immunodeficiency virus, and we often see it, of course, as HIV/AIDS. The goal in our continuum of care is for people not to progress towards AIDS, or the clinical diagnosis for the set number of T cells that a person is, in essence, left with. What I do want to point out for this slide is that there is no cure for HIV infection. And I recently wrote an op-ed that talked about why certain people in the African American community embrace conspiracy theories, and looking at the stigma attached with it. What's key here is, no matter how you identify, Kermit the Frog, me, you, Mickey Mouse, HIV is transmitted in the exact same way for everybody. It's some type of form of bodily fluid going from point A to point B. A mistake that we tend to make in the field is we identify people by their personal characteristics as a risk factor and not by the actual behavior itself. So, however these bodily fluids are being transmitted along, the shift now is that we need to make changes, and here's why. For men who have sex with men, for us that is a behavior, because one's identity can be completely different from what we would assume that it may be. In that aspect of identifying the behavior, anal sex puts men who have sex with men at a higher risk. Anal sex, no matter who you are, like I said, Kermit the Frog, me, you, Mickey Mouse, puts anybody at a more increased risk for HIV because anus is not lubricated. You have more aspects or more chances of ripping and tearing. However, whenever I say Kermit the Frog, me, you, Mickey Mouse, I'm removing an identity to get you to start looking at the aspect of behavior. So, for men who have sex with men, increased risk factors in that aspect would be condom use during sex that is considered more risky because of the physical aspect of it. And then now if we look at the identity, because sometimes we tend to forget that in a situation where you have the same gender-loving aspect of it, and it's male, female, or sexual minorities, that network is pretty tight, pretty close together. So if there's high prevalence of HIV in one sexual network, sexual networks are smaller, it increases the risk for HIV. Knowledge of one's HIV status. The thought is, if you know your status, you will either engage in behaviors to remain negative or engage in behaviors to protect yourself and others if you're positive. The component of discrimination, stigma, and substance use. The second most common method of HIV transmission amongst men who have sex with men is substance use. Again, the aspect of bodily fluids being transmitted from one to another. 4, cis. And here is where we start to identify differences, but then we go back to behaviors. Cisgender, your identity matches what was checked on your birth certificate. Ironically, we tend to call that heterosexual. But then what we noticed in women, we were leaving out the component or the aspect of women in relationships with other women. And then they started to fall through the cracks. So in this component here, I am referring to men and women who identify as the gender checked on their birth certificate. For women, heterosexual contact is the primary method of transmission of HIV and AIDS. So their partner's behavior places them at an increased risk. Also, social factors that look at gender ratio imbalance. African Americans, more than any other race, are more likely to be linked to each other romantically, socially, friendship-wise, relationships, social networks, sexual networks. And remember, African Americans represent 12% of the population. So if African Americans are linked to each other in that aspect, and unfortunately, for the African American male-female ratio of available partners is at about 75 to 100. You're going to have incidences of partner sharing. I say partner sharing, not infidelity, not cheating, partner sharing. All races engage in concurrent relationships. That means you're in a sexual relationship and you start another one before the previous one officially ends. Everybody with me? So, if person A dates person B, and person A and B get into an argument, and then person A starts dating person C, and then they get into an argument, and person B is back in the picture, that aspect of it is what we consider a concurrent relationship. Not cheating, not infidelity, but one relationship didn't officially end before moving to the other. That's key, because over time, we found in different studies, especially in certain countries in Africa, your marital status placed you at a more increased risk for HIV. Figure that one out. I mean, I'm not married. Nothing against being married. But we thought that was always very interesting. Attitudes towards condoms. Also, contextual factors such as socioeconomic status, discrimination, stigma, and victimization. For African American heterosexual males, primary method of transmission, again, heterosexual contact, but not nearly as much for females in substance use. For our trans population, in other words, can y'all still hear me? Y'all can still hear me? I see you on the monitor. Yeah, I mean, they can still hear me. Oh, Lord. Yeah, okay. I'm going to just hold it. Okay, so for the trans population, in here I am simply referring to those whose gender identity or gender expression does not match what was on their birth certificate. It's key here that we understand the difference between behavior and identity simply because members of the trans population have a higher rate of engaging in sexual exchange for goods, resources, or money. And somehow down the line, whenever we do or we think about intervention for people who engage in sex work, we tend to focus our efforts on the trans population. Kermit the Frog, me, you, Mickey Mouse. If they engaged in sexual exchange for goods, service, or money, they would be at an increased risk for HIV as well. The reason why this behavior places one at an increased risk is because you're more likely to have multiple sexual partners. You're less likely to wear condoms because, simply put, in my interview study, well, see, I can charge more without a condom. Okay, well, since you put it that way, you are correct. And then also, again, the aspect of substance use and negative health encounters. What's key with trans, the expression is based on the noun that comes afterwards. So in dealing in within a society where bathroom identity, things of that nature is key, you have the component of the aspect of stigma and needing to earn money. And this is why the trans population tends to engage in sexual exchange for money, goods, and things of that nature at a higher rate. So I'm going to switch gears right quick and say, you're looking at the idea, the component of behaviors that influence HIV across the board for anybody. When it relates to African Americans, this is where things become different. If we look at the term social determinants of health, starting with social, the environmental conditions by which a person is born, lives, learns, works, plays, socializes, ages in, engages in, things of that nature. And if you see any typos, I corrected them, but just take my word for it. On the other one, but I'm going to float right on by. So that environment in which you pretty much engage in just about everything. I mean, I live in Dallas. I'm originally from Atlanta. And if it wasn't for the fact that I had to do this presentation and I had to do another presentation Saturday, my social environment would then have me back in the capital of Georgia to go to the game. Yes, I am dropping some serious hints because there's a possibility that we might be going to the Super Bowl, and I am just so happy about that. If you recall our last visit to the Super Bowl, it wasn't the best thing. These things within your environment to look at socially include geographical location, the type of housing you live in, the housing structures you live within, school systems, educational resources, because the space that you occupy determines your well-being. And when I say space, I'm talking about tangible and intangible space. Spaces in social settings. You have your physical space in a social setting, but then you will also have that intangible aspect that you occupy. Oh, well, you know, that person is the alpha whenever we go out. Or that person always has to drive whenever we go out. The aspect of what is it like within these social settings, these social networks, and also these sexual networks. When we look at determinants of health, encompassing well-being or quality of life. And I'm pretty sure everybody here is familiar with it. Oh, physical, mental, social, environmental, all of that great stuff. The differences in well-being come into effect when we start looking at a person's socioeconomic status. And here's why. One's SES, socioeconomic status, is a proxy of three very important things: economic earnings and income, the social aspect of it within education, and the work occupation. To give you an example as to why that is key. In elementary and middle school, and now that I think about it, it probably was not the best way to protect people's privacy, but whenever my teachers would call roll, and I went to a magnet school, you would either say, here, brought my lunch, reduced, or free. However, in my eyes, my friends that would say free and reduce, they were cool. Like, those were the cool kids. Like, I had the most amount of fun with them. So I went home to my parents and was like, I fill this out because I want to be free and reduced too. Having no clue as to what it meant. In my eyes, the proxy was, if you said free and reduced, you were cool. And my parents were like, sweetie, you ask us this every year. And we think it's the dumbest thing that you could have ever thought of, but let that go. When we look at health, of course, I know I am preaching to the choir here. Not just the absence of sickness or frailty, but looking at it from that physical, mental, and social well-being status with factors such as, which includes biological and genetic factors, individual behaviors, physical environment, health services, and social environment. And so here's what it looks like. Now, these just imagine if they popped up. So we're going to start in the top left with education. If you recall, and it's funny because I've had the fortunate pleasure of teaching at every single grade level in the education system there is. And nobody in here is an undergraduate, is it? Are they? I realize undergraduate students are just like middle schoolers. With that being said, you spend the most of your developmental years socially in school. As you think about this, give you another little example. Fulton County, which is where Atlanta, the seat of Atlanta, before I moved to Dallas, there was a rift in which the north part of the county wanted to divide from the south part of the county. How many people in here are left-handed? One. You get to be North Fulton County. Everybody else, perfect analogy. Y'all are South Fulton County. Your test scores are always higher. The average income for your part of the county, and it was called Milton County, so your name will be Milton from this point forward. Average income was higher. Tax-based revenue was higher, so these resources could be poured into these schools. Fulton County, north and south, part of the same school district. So all of that Milton was making was transferring. The only one left-handed person here was transferring to everybody else. And so Milton finally said, I'm tired of this. I want my money to stay up here. I want the benefit of the good schools to stay up here. Because Fulton was getting ready to go to a system where if your school failed for X amount of years, the school district would pay to bus people to other schools, if by choice. So Milton, all of these people now are getting ready to have the option to come to school where you, by your lonesome, was handling. But keep that in mind, because I'm happy I asked who was left-handed. So, if we look at it socially, starts with our formal and informal education. My father will say you had no choice but to go to college, so please don't come and tell me you need a year off to discover yourself. I can give you a birth certificate. In that aspect of my informal education, college was next. College was like the 13th grade. I didn't know any better. For others, I get to go off and explore, find myself. Wow, my daddy said myself was on my birth certificate. Interaction with others, networking, and exposure. This is what you know. This is where you were taught. If traveling every summer was what you did, that's a part of your social aspect of networking. I went to Australia a couple of years ago, and I remember saying to somebody, gosh, I wish we were in school so I could write that report as to what did you do this summer, so I could share with everybody. From that is the interaction within your work, because your networking, your education leads to your occupational choices, your work conditions, your job availability, and your benefits and your insurance. People always say to me, I want your job, because you are never in the office. And I say that's because I'm allergic to 6 paid vacation days a year. But because of that, I'll never have a 6-figure job. Not in one position. Because I just like to not be in the office. But I know that from my type of work, my job, occupation. Remember I said I had the fortunate pleasure of teaching at every single grade level. Loved my summers off. But hated having to go to work every single day from 8 to 3:30. And when I taught middle school, from 9 to 4:30, which meant I got stuck in traffic. Because I know that, it then impacts my earnings, my income, my debt-to-income ratio, how and what I know about investments, savings, ownership, and the establishment of wealth. So if Milton has known this all along, Milton passes it along to her children, who then passes it along, because wealth is built over time. For everybody else in Fulton County, if you don't know it, you don't pass it along. And so that continues over generations. So, definition, social determinants of health. Complex, integrated, and overlapping social structures and economic systems that are responsible for most health inequities or conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. These circumstances are shaped by the distribution of money, power, resources at the global, national, and local levels. I'm going to define it for you like this. My brother is also left-handed, Milton County. And when he wanted to play baseball, we are 9 years apart. I was livid that I had to take him to go get a glove. Because I have a life, some things that I want to do as a 16-year-old. So I said to him, and he could sense that I really didn't want to do it, and that I was frustrated. Why is it taking you so long? Can you please just hurry up and find a glove? And he said to me, because I can't find one for left-handed baseball players. And I had to take a step back and realize, you know what, this is going to take some time. And so we had to go to 3 different stores that day. The difference, left-handed, right-handed. The inequities was the fact that he didn't have as many gloves, choices for baseball gloves because he was left-handed. The inequality in that is he either would have been stuck trying to figure out what to do with a right-handed glove, or he would have just called it quits because I was irritated and frustrated, and either never had the amount of practice as somebody who's right-handed because they can always find a glove, or he would have just had to suck it up and wait to ask my parents. Taking it out of that realm. That's how we view and identify social determinants of health. So, when we look at HIV and AIDS across the board, socioeconomic status, education, wealth, debt, occupation, access to care, transportation, job security, literacy rates, location, all of this begets where you live, where you play, where you go to school, your potential earning and income. The likelihood of people who are in poverty to engage in upward mobility is slim. So now think about sexual and social networks. You have relationships where you live. Housing options. I can't see that far. Crime rates, safety, the political climate, the government, and the infrastructure. I went skiing last weekend in Canada. When I saw the sign for Flint, Michigan, it broke my heart. And I think about it in that aspect of location, being able to move or deal with what was getting ready to, no pun intended, come down the pipe. Because the people in Flint, Michigan knew that this is not going to be good if they switch the water. But location-wise, there was nothing they could do. Why? Because of the aspect of upward mobility and being able to move. That leads to your inequities. Race, age, class, ethnicity. Again, differences. Nothing wrong with being different. The problem that comes with it are the avoidable negative aspects of it, based on gender, voting rights, sexuality, disabilities, political influence, and stress. It's very stressful in that component. Now we've talked about behaviors, social determinants of health. Finally, something to consider. Socio-ecologic model. I love it because it's a catch-all phrase. And if you throw it out at parties, people really think you're smart. But in that aspect of it, or that component, I was late. I got to my flight on time. But the universe was like, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of dip and rolls. But before we dip and roll, there were a lot of other planes that had to dip and roll, so your plane is going to be delayed taking off. Okay, cool. I get to the car rental place, ask for a full-size car, short. The heels fool you. And mental note, people associate status with height. So, you know, the taller I look, the taller I appear, the smarter people think I am. Get to the car rental place, they're out, so they give me a Jeep. But I can't lift the seat in the Jeep, so I can't see over the steering wheel. And then it's pouring down rain, and I'm hungry, and I have to go to the bathroom, and I'm soaking wet, and I don't have a raincoat or umbrella. I, in my individual behavior, did everything that I was supposed to do to get here on time. My own behaviors did not cause me to be late. And what the social ecological model says is that individuals function within multiple level components of influence within a reciprocal causation of behavioral influence, social norms, and governing entities. Social norms. if you're doing a presentation, I don't you need to be on time. You need to be here early to like make sure your laptop can connect. If not, you can go with plan B. Governing entities. But FAA said don't let those planes take off till the sale passes. And then behavioral influences of that aspect of, oh Lord, I gotta hurry up and get here because I don't want to be late. But it is pouring down rain and I'm in this rental and I did not get the extra insurance. So, what does this look like? Starting at the bottom, each person has some type of interpersonal relationship or behaviors. Those are the individual characteristics that identify you. So what you do, what you engage in, and what we try to change within you. Knowledge, skills, self-efficacy, confidence that you can engage in something. Interpersonal behaviors. It's a process for utilizing and identifying supports within groups of relationships. Now I'm about to tie this all back into HIV and African Americans. People who smoke know what to kill. And if anybody in here is a smoker, you don't have to fess up to it. But as a former smoker, I used to always say to people, don't you think I know that? And you know what caused me to smoke? Quit. Vanity. I went to get my teeth cleaned. And my dentist was like, yeah, your little habit is starting to show. I mean, I knew it was going to kill me, but that's not why I quit. For the record. Or I stopped eating beef, not because I was like, ooh, red meat bad, but because I had a great little incident with food poisoning. So that interpersonal aspect that we talk about, it's for some strange reason, that's where we start to it. That's where we place the most focus on HIV. But it's bodily fluids from point A to point B. Because somebody had to get it from somewhere. Interpersonal, family, friends, peers, and partners. What I love about HIV interventions in the past, condom use. Great. For African American women, time out. For women, 9 times out of 10, you're not the one wearing the condom. But that is what we tend to promote, engage in condom use. Organizational influence. Structures that influence the availability of resources. Here, I'm talking about churches, community-based organizations, stores, medical facilities, access to care. Remember, in the social determinants of health, where you live is key. In Frisco, which is the actual suburb that I live in, there's an urgent care center on every single corner. Also, my dentist, my doctor, my dry cleaning, the people who do my nails, just about all of my doctors are within about a 10-mile radius from me. I mean, if I was really bored one day, I could walk and do everything. And I have sidewalks to be able to do it. I mean, I used to be an avid runner until I ran into a copperhead, and I was like, nobody told me about this about Texas. But that component of not only the aspect of the organizational that influences behavior, also the community. Regulations, norms created by surrounding environments and identity, such as social networks, structures, gender norms, and social norms. When I turned about, and I don't have a problem telling my age, I'm 43. When I turned 40, my parents finally stopped asking, when are you going to get married? And I was like, even though I would ignore y'all, just wondering why. And they said, we actually thought about it. Your brother, and my brother, who's 9 years younger than me, is 34, and he may not get married. And he looks worse, according to society, being that old and not married. So we're going to try to figure out what's going on with him. And I had to just laugh, and I was like, yeah, that's true. It does look bad. So what are our social norms as we look at these activities that we behave in that exchange bodily fluids? And then finally, public policies that regulate and support actions and practices at both the local, state, and federal level. So here's what it looks like. The interpersonal level for men who have sex with men. Knowledge about HIV, extremely high. The skills and ability or the self-efficacy to be able to engage in preventive measures, extremely high. So in understanding, okay, So why is it not taking place? Across the board also with African American, with cis and heterosexual African American men and women and trans African American men and women. Differences start here. The interpersonal aspect of it, victimization. One of the risk factors for being victimized is whether or not you were victimized before. Sex workers, higher rates of being victimized, robbed, beaten, assaulted, things of that nature. Also, how much power you actually have if you are in a sexually concurrent relationship within your sexual networks and your ability to negotiate condom use. Research has shown, I'm going to just break it down. One of the key components of condom use is how you value the relationship. Because if you're in a serious relationship and condoms are introduced, it causes you to question whether or not the relationship is serious or if the person is seeing somebody else. One of the interviews I did, a woman told me, yeah, my friend said that, yeah, she wear condoms with her boyfriend, her man, and I told her, well, you're not the main boo, because you don't wear condoms with the main boo. And I said to her, you just destroyed like 10 years of the past work that I have been doing, because we're trying to get everybody to wear condoms. That's also why we started to identify the behavior, men who have sex with men. Because in African American communities, since the aspect of being gay has more of a negative connotation, we were starting to miss people who identified as heterosexual, but their orientation may not have been. Because your orientation is not based on you, it's based on the person you're attracted to. So if you identify as a woman and you're attracted as a woman, your orientation is one that says same gender based on the component of relationships. Organizational, allocations, access to resources, and linkage to care. If we look at it from a bipartisan component or aspect, in order for HIV positive people to keep their viral load or viral count down or suppressed, virologically suppressed, I think is the new phrase, they have to have access to HIV meds. If you don't have access to HIV meds because where you live, transportation, or politics has closed where you get that access to, or a reduction in the allocation of funding, your behavior falls at the level of control at the organizational aspect. Community, poverty, socioeconomic status, stigma, and social norms. Stigma does not exist in a vacuum. It's the view of others that leads one to be isolated. Addressing stigma, whether or not, A, one is HIV positive. Ooh, anybody here familiar with the story of Cicely Bolden out of Dallas, Texas? She revealed to her partner she was HIV positive, and then he came and murdered her children, found her. They had been in a relationship very, very long time. And from family members who knew her, they stated that she had told him. However, the person who killed her, he was married. And of course, that became the focus. And I was like, ooh, excuse me. So not the fact that this married man was engaged in a sexually concurrent relationship, period. But, well, she was HIV positive and he was married. So what about his wife? He wouldn't think about his wife. I bring all of that to the forefront again to say, beyond the realms of individual control. So if people kill based on somebody's HIV status, how effective are we going to be to get people to disclose to make sure that their partner can engage in certain things such as PrEP or utilizing PrEP? And then the component of public policy as it relates to incarceration rates, federal, state, and local spending. When I said that for African Americans, we're looking at about a 4-to-1 ratio, 75 men for every 100 women. Reason being, African American males are more likely to be incarcerated. African American males are also more likely to suffer from homicide, already be married, engage in relationships outside of their race, or express the desire to be with men compared to women. The reason why incarceration rates come into play. Aspects of the crack epidemic. Also, the rights that you lose once you are released from jail. Now, if I'd have got here on time, I'd have asked for a time check, and then I'd have asked people, well, how are you addressing the social determinants of health in your HIV AIDS outreach? And I would have corrected that to say, do your intervention plans and ideas and strategies address multiple influences of the social ecological model? And here's why. When you move forward for developing your strategies to address AIDS amongst African Americans, it's not just a disease that's being transmitted. A lot of what I've talked about on these slides also apply to other health issues. The importance of knowing your status. Okay. Well, it's funny. I tell people I always know it's October no matter the date because I can look at a football game and somebody has on pink. To push the need for mammograms. Okay, well, that's the same as knowing your status. In that aspect, CDC and American Public Health Association created a joint report to look at criteria that should be included when addressing health education and promotion. Address one or more specific risk factors defined as measurable, modifiable, and preventable. Knowing your status. We in the field of HIV, we love to isolate ourselves. And I'm like, however, it's the same thing as when we promote anybody else knowing their status. Remember the first time I found out what my cholesterol levels were. And I was like, oh, okay, is that good? And my doctor was like, no, it is. You're going to die. What are you doing? I was on the, so I was on like, instead of South Beach, I was kind of like on Midwest, North, somewhere, lake diet. And I was just basically eating bacon and eggs. I was working on my PhD. You know how easy it is to make bacon and eggs? That is what I was eating. And I had lost so much weight and I was sexy. And she was like, yeah, I need you never to eat another egg again. Or I don't cook. But I thought I was doing real good because I would go to Trader Joe's and get all these frozen foods, vegetables and the veggie quesadillas and all that great stuff. And when my doctor, another doctor, my doctors, she was like, I have to categorize you as pre-diabetic. What are you doing? What are you eating? I'm eating healthy. And she was like, are you putting it in the oven? No, I have books in my oven. I'm putting it in the microwave. Why? Because that was the year that we in Dallas suffered that heat wave where we had over 70 days of it being 100 degrees plus. And when you don't cook for 70 days, the rest of the year just falls soon. So, risk factors, defined, measurable, modifiable, and preventable for not just HIV and AIDS, but for other health issues. Reflect considerations of special characteristics, needs, and preferences for your target group. On the last slide, I will show you strategies that work for the best different groups. What works for MSM does not work for trans communities. And what works for women does not work for men. Sounds like a lot, takes a lot of time, effort, money, and energy, but it's key. Include interventions that clearly and effectively reduce risk factors, and are appropriate for a particular setting. On college campuses, I love it. Condom drives work the best. I participated in something, we made a condom tree and gave it away. I knew the person who won the condom tree. 6 months later, I was like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why are these condoms? Because I know you got a girl. What am I missing? Identify and implement interventions that make optimum use of available resources, and from the onset, be organized, planned, and implement. From the onset, be organized, planned, and implement in a manner for the process in which an evaluation can take place. Tying it all together. Yes, this is a repeat. Risk factors that place African Americans at risk for HIV varies amongst different categories. For men who have sex with men, it's lack of condom use. It's also high prevalence of HIV among sexual networks. It's a lack of knowledge about their HIV status. It's the component of discrimination and fear of stigma. From dealing with the stigmatized view of the behavior of being in a same gender loving relationship and the stigma associated with HIV itself, and then as a coping strategy, substance use. Increased risk factors that place African American women at a higher risk. It is their sexual partner's behavior, and then social factors beyond their control, such as the gender ratio imbalance. Research has shown there is a comforting and a supportive aspect that comes out of being in a committed relationship. Attitudes towards condom use, and then other contextual factors such as low socioeconomic status, discrimination, stigma, and victimization, which tends to boil down to the need for social support, because there is a comforting aspect of being in a serious, committed relationship. For the trans population, African Americans that identify as trans, it is receptive anal sex without a condom, high prevalence of HIV within sexual networks, sex with multiple partners, based on a higher rate of engaging in sex for exchange of drugs or money, resources and goods, substance use as a coping strategy, and then negative health encounters for being unable to find somebody that can deal with or is culturally competent to understand their primary concerns. Nowhere in there did I say primary risk factors was bodily fluids being transmitted from one person to the other. How do we address that? Final slide. Okay. How do we address that? Well, research has shown us that within evidence-based interventions, strategies, condom distribution, because those work at the individual behavioral level best for men who have sex with men. Also, based on the nature of that sexual and social network, community-based outreach, targeted testing, in which you do testing targeted towards high-risk behaviors. So if you report engaging in anal receptive sex without a condom, and you use drugs or report substance use, targeted testing for those at an increased risk tends to be effective in social marketing strategies. You know why social marketing strategies work? Because men who have sex with men are more likely to be on social apps. Like, I'm still waiting to log on to see what the hype is about Tinder, and I am scared that it's going to be 3 weeks later, and people are going to say, well, I have been on Tinder in my life, because it is very informative. For cis women, cis, and here I'm sticking with cis, as in your gender matches your birth certificate. Your gender expression matches your birth certificate, and I'll tell you why in a second. These items have to be gender specific. Also, related to the sense of empowerment. Women are nurturing. By default, women tend to put others first. So that aspect of empowerment to be more concerned about your own health. Sensitive to the aspect of culture and intersectionality. For instance, I stand before you as an African American, as a woman, and then as a third identity as an African American woman. So the component of intersectionality that is different from the first two identities of being African American and being a woman. Fewer sessions. I thought that was interesting. But for cis African American women, fewer sessions tend to have more impact or effect, and then women-led or women-centered. Interventions developed for other at-risk groups with similar behaviors have been adopted for use with transgender people. However, their effectiveness is still unknown. There is a need for effective interventions that address the multiple co-occurring public health problems in transgender persons. And here's why. because trans individuals go by the noun that follows trans. And if our interventions don't address the behaviors by removing some of the components of identity, we tend to miss a lot of people. If I want to go to a concert and somebody that I'm seeing says, yeah, I'll take you to the concert, but what I'm going to get for it? I mean, you coming home with me or not? Okay, sure. See, I just engaged in sexual exchange for goods, services, drugs, or money. That's not how I'm going to see it. So if I come to you and I say, you're trans, you need to participate in this intervention because of, you could possibly engage in sex work. Not that many people I know, even if they do it, are going to say, you're right. Because there's a lot of backstory to it. So what evidence-based interventions are stated, CDC, several different meta-analyses that have been conducted. When we look at other risk groups with similar behaviors, they've been adopted and effective for trans populations. And that is where we need to focus our efforts as we continue to move on. Because also within science, when we do clinical trials,